The rise and fall of Theodore McCarrick. He advised presidents. He met with popes. For nearly 2 decades, he was one of the most powerful and most public faces of the Catholic Church in America, a cardinal whose voice carried weight in Rome, in Washington, and in capitals around the world. He was photographed shaking hands with world leaders, praised from pulpits across the country, and trusted with some of the Church's most sensitive diplomatic missions. And then, within the span of a single year, nearly all of it came apart. How did one of the most respected church leaders in modern American history lose everything? His title, his ministry, and ultimately, his place within the priesthood itself. The answer took decades to surface. And when it finally did, it forced the Catholic Church to confront not just one man's conduct, but the institutional silence that had protected him. This is the story of Theodore McCarrick. Theodore Edgar McCarrick was born in New York City on July 7, 1930. His father, a ship's captain, died when he was still a small child, leaving his mother to raise him largely on her own during the hardest years of the Great Depression. Faith and education were treated in his household as inseparable, and by the time he reached adolescence, McCarrick had already set his sights on the priesthood. He attended Fordham University in the Bronx, where classmates and teachers alike remembered him as sharp, ambitious, and unusually comfortable in front of a crowd. From there, he went on to study at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., pursuing the long formation required of every Catholic priest, years of theology, philosophy, and spiritual training that would shape not only his beliefs, but the institutional world he would spend the rest of his life navigating. He was ordained a priest in 1958 at the age of 28. From his earliest assignments, colleagues described him as an unusually gifted communicator. Someone who could deliver a homily that moved a congregation to tears, then walk into a room of wealthy donors and secure a building fund in a single conversation. Those 2 skills, pastoral warmth and financial acumen, would define the entire arc of his rise through the Church. But even in these formative years, according to accounts that would not become public until decades later, there were early signs, quiet, scattered, and largely unspoken, a behavior that stood in sharp contrast to the image McCarrick presented to the wider Church. For years, those signs would remain confined to whispered conversations among a small number of insiders, never reaching the public, and rarely resulting in any formal consequence. That contrast between the public reputation and the private reality would come to define McCarrick's entire career, and it is a thread this documentary will follow from here forward. In 1977, at the age of 46, McCarrick was named an auxiliary bishop of New York, becoming one of the youngest bishops in the country at the time of his appointment. It was an early sign of just how quickly his star was rising within the American church hierarchy. For years later, in 1981, Pope John Paul II created an entirely new diocese in New Jersey, the Diocese of Metuchen, and named McCarrick its first bishop. Building a diocese from nothing requires precisely the skills McCarrick had already demonstrated: fundraising, organizational leadership, and the ability to inspire loyalty among clergy and lay people alike. He excelled at all 3. In 1986, McCarrick was elevated again, this time to Archbishop of Newark, one of the largest and most influential archdioceses in the United States. Over the following 14 years, he transformed his public profile from a respected regional bishop into a genuinely national and eventually international Catholic figure. He became especially known for his diplomatic work on behalf of the Church, engaging directly with foreign governments on issues of religious freedom and human rights. He traveled to China, to Vietnam, and to other countries where the Catholic Church faced government restriction, working to open channels of dialogue that few other American churchmen were positioned to pursue. That work earned him a reputation in Washington policy circles as a churchman who understood diplomacy as fluently as he understood theology. He also became a familiar and welcome presence in interfaith settings, building relationships with Jewish, Muslim, and Protestant leaders that extended his influence well beyond the boundaries of the Catholic Church itself. In the year 2000, Pope John Paul II named McCarrick Archbishop of Washington, D.C., placing at the head of the archdiocese that includes the nation's capital, and put him in regular, direct contact with the highest levels of American government. The following year, in 2001, he was elevated to Cardinal, joining the small body of church leaders responsible for advising the Pope and eventually electing his successor. By the early 2000s, Cardinal McCarrick stood, by nearly every public measure, at the absolute peak of American Catholic life. He appeared at presidential inaugurations. He delivered the invocation at major national events. He was a trusted advisor within Vatican circles, and one of the most quoted, most photographed Catholic leaders in the country, appearing regularly on television and in print media as the Church's American voice on issues ranging from immigration to foreign policy. In 2002, as the American Catholic Church confronted a wave of clergy sexual abuse revelations that would come to be known as the Boston Crisis, McCarrick was among the bishops who helped shape the Church's formal response, the Dallas Charter, a set of national policies intended to protect children and restore public trust in the wake of the scandal. It was, in hindsight, one of the most striking ironies of his career. A churchman helping to build the very framework meant to prevent the kind of conduct that, according to later investigations, he himself had already engaged in for years. To the public and to most of the priests and seminarians who served under him, Cardinal McCarrick appeared to be exactly what his title suggested: a devoted, tireless servant of the Church, admired across generations and across political lines, respected by Republicans and Democrats alike for his diplomatic reach and his pastoral warmth. But behind that carefully maintained public image, according to accounts that would not surface widely for years, a very different pattern of behavior was allegedly already well underway, one involving young seminarians under his direct authority, and one that a number of church officials over multiple decades would come to know about long before the public ever did. As Archbishop of Newark and later Washington, McCarrick developed a habit, according to numerous later accounts from seminarians and young priests, of inviting them to a beach house he owned along the New Jersey shore. Sleeping arrangements at the house were often deliberately limited, several of these men later said, requiring seminarians to share a bed with the Archbishop himself, sometimes alongside other guests, in a setup that made refusal feel effectively impossible. Several of these men later described the experience as deeply uncomfortable and coercive, shaped by the enormous power imbalance between a cardinal who controlled nearly every aspect of their ordination and career prospects, and young men who depended entirely on his approval to advance in the priesthood. Some described feeling that any objection could end their path to ordination entirely. For years, according to later reporting, rumors of this behavior circulated within certain circles of the Church, among some seminary staff, some fellow bishops, and some Vatican officials. In at least a few documented instances, formal concerns were raised through internal church channels, including letters sent directly to Vatican offices describing troubling behavior involving seminarians. Separately, the archdioceses of Newark and Metuchen had, by the early 2000s, quietly reached financial settlements with at least 2 adult men who had accused McCarrick of sexual misconduct, settlements that came with confidentiality provisions and that remained unknown to the general public for roughly 15 years. Despite these internal warnings, McCarrick's career continued to advance without visible interruption. He was named Archbishop of Washington in 2000 and elevated to Cardinal the following year, appointments that came even as at least some church officials, including individuals within the Vatican itself, were already aware that serious concerns about his conduct had been raised. For most Catholics, and for most of the wider public, none of this was visible. McCarrick's public reputation as a beloved, tireless churchman remained fully intact for another 18 years, a gap between private knowledge and public perception that would later become one of the central questions the Church itself would be forced to confront. McCarrick officially retired as Archbishop of Washington in 2006 upon reaching the customary retirement age for bishops. But retirement did little to slow him down. He remained an active, visible figure in American Catholic and diplomatic life for another 12 years, continuing to travel internationally, speak at conferences, and represent the Church in settings that few retired archbishops ever occupy. That gap between reputation and reality would not remain closed forever. What happened next would begin to unravel nearly 6 decades of carefully built trust. In June of 2018, an allegation surfaced that would change everything. An Archdiocese of New York review board determined that an allegation against McCarrick, involving the sexual abuse of a minor altar boy in New York decades earlier, was credible and substantiated. In response, Pope Francis removed McCarrick from public ministry, ordering him to a life of prayer and penance while the Church investigated further. The announcement stunned much of the Catholic world. Until that point, McCarrick had remained a visible, active presence in American Catholic life even in retirement, regularly appearing at church events and continuing informal diplomatic work well into his late 80s. In the weeks that followed, additional accusers began to come forward, not only involving the sexual abuse of a minor, but also detailed accounts from multiple former seminarians describing sexual coercion and misconduct as adults under McCarrick's direct authority, including the beach house arrangements many of them had quietly discussed among themselves for years, but had never before spoken about publicly. The accounts, once made public, describe a strikingly consistent pattern across different dioceses and different decades. Evidence, investigators would later conclude, a behavior that had continued largely unchecked for most of McCarrick's career, from his years in New Jersey through his tenure in Washington. What made these accounts especially difficult for many Catholics to process was not just their content, but their sheer volume, and the realization that so many of them described nearly identical circumstances, separated by 20 or 30 years. In July of 2018, facing the mounting accounts and the credible finding regarding the New York case, McCarrick resigned from the College of Cardinals, an extraordinary and historically rare step for a man who had once been among the most prominent cardinals in the country. Cardinals almost never resign. The position is typically held until death. Pope Francis ordered a formal Vatican investigation into what church officials had known about McCarrick's conduct and when they had known it. Over the following 2 years, Vatican investigators reviewed decades of internal records, correspondence, and testimony from dozens of witnesses, including bishops, former seminarians, and Vatican officials who had interacted with McCarrick across his entire career. The investigation's findings, when they were finally released, would raise questions not just about one man, but about the systems of trust and oversight that had allowed his conduct to continue for so long, across 3 different postings and 5 decades of ministry. In November of 2020, the Vatican released its findings in a lengthy report that came to be known publicly as the McCarrick Report. Running to hundreds of pages, it documented, in extensive and often uncomfortable detail, a pattern of warnings about McCarrick's conduct that had reached senior church officials, including, the report found, Pope John Paul II himself, dating back to at least the late 1990s, warnings that were ultimately dismissed, downplayed, or inadequately investigated at the time. The report concluded that McCarrick had, on multiple occasions, misrepresented his own conduct directly to church officials investigating him, and that a combination of incomplete information, misplaced personal trust, and institutional reluctance to challenge a rising and diplomatically valuable churchman had allowed him to continue advancing to the hierarchy for years after serious concerns had already been raised internally. The report also found that McCarrick had personally lobbied for his own promotions, at points directly reassuring Vatican officials that allegations against him were untrue, assurances that were, at the time, largely accepted without independent verification. Even before that lengthy report was released, the Church had already taken its most severe possible action. In February 2019, Pope Francis formally laicized Theodore McCarrick, stripping him of the clerical state entirely. It made him the first cardinal in modern history to be dismissed from the priesthood over allegations of sexual abuse, a punishment reserved for the Church's most serious offenses, and one that effectively ended, in the eyes of the Church, his existence as a priest. For an institution built on the permanence of ordination, Catholic teaching holds that priesthood leaves an indelible spiritual mark. Laicization represented as complete a repudiation as the Church could offer. McCarrick was no longer, in any formal sense recognized by the Church, a priest at all. But the consequences of his conduct were not confined to church tribunals and Vatican reports. They were about to move into criminal courtrooms as well. A step almost unheard of for a man who had once stood among the most senior clergy in the country, and one that would test whether the American legal system could hold him accountable in ways the Church itself could not. In September of 2021, Massachusetts prosecutors charged McCarrick, then 91 years old, with 3 counts of indecent assault and battery, related to allegations that he had sexually abused a 16-year-old boy, a family friend, during a wedding reception at Wellesley College in 1974. He pleaded not guilty at his arraignment. It made him the highest-ranking Catholic official in American history to face criminal charges in a clergy sexual abuse case, a milestone that drew national and international media attention. The following year, in April of 2023, A separate criminal case emerged in Wisconsin, alleging that McCarrick had sexually assaulted the same victim as an 18-year-old during a 1977 visit to a lakeside cabin near Geneva Lake. Part of what prosecutors described as a pattern of abuse against the same young man that had allegedly continued for years, beginning, according to the criminal complaint, when the boy was as young as 11, and continuing at gatherings where the complaint alleged. Other adult men were also involved. As both cases moved forward, McCarrick's legal team raised a new and difficult question. Not whether the alleged conduct had occurred, but whether the man now in his 90s was mentally capable of standing trial for it all. In February of 2023, McCarrick's attorneys formally requested that the Massachusetts charges be dismissed, citing a medical evaluation conducted by experts at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine that found he suffered from significant and worsening dementia, likely caused by Alzheimer's disease. A psychologist retained separately by prosecutors reached a similar conclusion after conducting her own evaluation that June, testifying that McCarrick showed serious deficits of memory and was often unable to recall details from one conversation to the next, even within the same hour, and that his condition was not one that medication could improve. In August of 2023, a Massachusetts judge agreed, ruling that McCarrick was not competent to stand trial and dismissing all charges. Prosecutors themselves acknowledged in court that they no longer had a good faith basis to continue the case, given the unanimous medical findings on both sides. 5 months later, in January of 2024, a Wisconsin judge reached the same conclusion, suspending the criminal case there as well, citing the same medical findings and appointing the same evaluating psychologist to apply the relevant standard under Wisconsin law. For the man who had once faced the possibility of becoming the first American cardinal convicted of child sexual abuse, the outcome was neither conviction nor acquittal, but something far more ambiguous. A case that would never be resolved in open court because the defendant was no longer considered capable of participating in his own defense. It is a legal outcome distinct from innocence and distinct from guilt. The charges were dismissed on competency grounds, not on the underlying facts of the case. For the survivor at the center of both cases, and for others who had waited years, in some instances decades, to see their allegations addressed in a courtroom, the dismissals brought a particular and complicated kind of pain, an ending without the resolution a trial might have offered, and a reminder that some forms of legal accountability remain permanently out of reach once enough time has passed. Church leaders, for their part, largely reiterated what the Vatican's own report had already concluded, that McCarrick's conduct represented a profound betrayal of trust, and that the institutional failures that allowed it to continue for so long demanded lasting reform, not just consequences for one man grown too old to face trial. Public reaction to the entire unfolding story, from the 2018 removal through the eventual dismissal of criminal charges nearly 6 years later, was consistently one of the more difficult reckonings the American Catholic Church has faced in the modern era, not simply because of what McCarrick himself had allegedly done, but because of how long and at how many levels of the institution the warnings about him had gone unheeded. The McCarrick case became one of the most consequential moments in the broader reckoning the Catholic Church has faced over clergy's sexual abuse, not only for what it revealed about one man's conduct, but for what the Vatican's own investigation revealed about the institutional culture that allowed it to continue for the better part of 5 decades. In the years following McCarrick Report's release, the Vatican implemented new global norms, a set of church-wide policies known formally as Vos Estis Lux Mundi, requiring bishops and religious superiors to report allegations of abuse and cover-ups through defined channels, and establishing clearer procedures for investigating bishops and cardinals accused of misconduct. These reforms were directly shaped by the specific failures the McCarrick case had exposed, particularly the absence, for most of his career, of any formal mechanism for investigating allegations against a sitting bishop or cardinal. For seminarians and young priests across the country, the case prompted difficult but necessary conversations about the power dynamics inherent in church formation and about the particular vulnerability of young men whose entire futures could depend on the approval of a single, powerful superior. Conversations that many seminary programs have since incorporated directly into formation training. For many Catholics, the case forced an uncomfortable reassessment of trust itself, a recognition that even the Church's most visible, most celebrated leaders could conceal serious misconduct for decades, protected in part by their own usefulness and influence within the institution, and by a culture that, for too long, prioritized institutional reputation over the safety of the people within it. Before we turn to what this case ultimately came to mean for the wider church, we want to take a moment to say thank you, genuinely, for spending this time with us. If you appreciate documentaries that take the time to get the details right, to separate fact from speculation, and to treat difficult subjects with the seriousness they deserve, we'd be grateful if you consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It means more than you might think, and it helps us keep making documentaries like this one. For the survivors whose accounts finally brought McCarrick's conduct into the open, the outcome remains in many ways incomplete. Neither the Vatican's laicization nor the dismissed criminal cases delivered the kind of full public reckoning many of them had hoped for. What they did deliver, after decades of silence, was formal acknowledgement from the church itself and eventually from the wider public that what they had experienced was real and that it had been known at some level for far longer than most people ever realized. The case of Theodore McCarrick endures, more than anything, as a study in the mechanics of institutional failure. Not a single decision or a single cover-up, but a long accumulation of warnings dismissed, settlements kept quiet, and a powerful man's usefulness repeatedly weighed against the credibility of the people accusing him. It is a pattern that took nearly 60 years to fully surface, and one that required an unusually determined group of survivors, journalists, and eventually the Vatican's own investigators to finally bring into the light. It is also, in its way, a story about what accountability can and cannot restore. McCarrick lost his title, his office, and ultimately his place within the priesthood itself. But for the men who say their lives were shaped by what happened to them decades earlier, no formal church action and no courtroom outcome could fully undo the harm, and no dismissal of charges, however legally justified, could offer the closure a full trial might have provided. What the case leaves behind, finally, is a set of questions the Catholic Church, and every institution built on concentrated trust and authority, continues to wrestle with: how warning signs are heard, who is believed, and what it costs an institution, and the people within it, when the answer for too long is not enough. Theodore McCarrick's story is not simply the story of one man's rise and fall. It is a reminder that authority, however earned, requires constant and genuine accountability, and that the willingness to listen, early and seriously, to those who come forward may be the truest measure of any institution's integrity, long before a scandal ever forces a question into the open. If this documentary gave you something to think about, we'd welcome your thoughts in the comments below. Please keep the conversation respectful, as this story involves real survivors and real harm. If you found this valuable, please consider subscribing, sharing it with someone who might appreciate it, and watching another of our investigations linked at the end of this video. Thank you again for watching.